For the last 2 weeks, we took a look at the Cold War. At first, how it manifested in growing tensions in Europe and in Asia. And last week, we looked at the war in Korea, which ended in a stalemate. This week, we're going to take a look at how that fear of communism and the fear of the Soviet Union dominating played out at home, the Red Scare in the 1950s. This is also known as the McCarthy era because of Senator Joseph McCarthy from Wisconsin, who single-handedly stirred up the fear of communism to make a name for himself. So were there any communists in America? It makes sense that there were undoubtedly some. President Truman was considered by many people to be soft on communism. It probably didn't help that he forbid Douglas MacArthur from taking the war any farther in Korea. The term limited war was coined by him, which became U.S. policy going forward, because any total war or total victory could end up in annihilation due to nuclear weapons. As we know, MacArthur disagreed and said, quote, "In war, there can be no substitute for victory." Had we seen something like this before? Of course. After World War I was the first Red Scare, where fear of revolution, such as had occurred in Russia, fear of anarchists, fear of immigrants, fear of others, radicals, ended up, of course, in the famous case that we looked at Sacco and Vanzetti. Take a look at these two little videos. They're posted in classwork. The propaganda that Americans were subject to in order to help them try and defeat the millions, in question mark, of communists in the United States. And come back when you're done. Okay, in 1947, the federal government created the Loyalty Review Board, and anybody who was a federal employee would have to answer a series of questions that were intended to determine if there was anything in their past or present that might show that they were not a true and loyal American. Some could argue that this is legitimate. You don't want to have communists working in your government. On the other hand, some people thought it went too far, because after all, it is not illegal to be a communist. The House of Representatives created perhaps one of the most devious and divisive committees in U.S. history. Its nickname was WAC, or its acronym, and of course some people like to say it WAC with a W. Technically, it was the House Un-American Activities Committee. And in 1947, they launched a series of investigations into alleged communist activities. Were there communists in the United States? And if there were, what were they trying to do? In particular, they investigated Hollywood. Just like today, where many people accuse those in the movie industry of being liberal elites and trying to dictate how the United States should go, many people felt that Hollywood types, screenwriters, directors, actresses, actors, were secret communists. And they created a blacklist. If your name was on the blacklist, it meant that you were suspected of being a communist or taking part in communist activities, and your livelihood would be affected. They would not be hired, and many people's careers were ruined. Early in the 50s, 10 Hollywood people were arrested, some with little to no evidence, and some people came out in support of them, but more people did not. And some brave people would publish their books and their plays under their own names, and give the money to them because they would not be hired in Hollywood. Take a look at this short video to see how that played out. Okay, so here's our question. Were there spies in the United States? Yeah, there were some. Look at the handout that I posted, which will help you keep straight some of these different spies. So the first thing happened in 1948. A man named Whittaker Chambers, who was a former communist turned democracy-loving capitalist, and he identified a spy, or alleged spy, by the name of Alger Hiss. Is that not the best name for a spy? He was a State Department official, and he was accused of having been a communist in the 1930s. Now, many people were communist in the 1930s. As we know, the Great Depression was occurring, and many people felt that democratic capitalism could not handle what was occurring and was not helping those that needed it. And some people, for lack of a better word, flirted with the Communist Party. Chambers claimed that Hiss had given him secret documents, and Hiss was put on trial, but there wasn't enough evidence to try him for spying. Instead, he was convicted of perjury, of lying under oath, and he served 3 years in jail. His case was pushed forward and argued by a young California congressman by the name of Richard Nixon, who of course would become the first and only president to resign in disgrace from office. Okay. Here is a picture of young Congressman Nixon, and here is a video clip that is pretty funny. I really wonder if it was done as tongue-in-cheek at the time. It's called "He May Be a Communist." Look at that, posted on classwork, and then come back. Okay, so now that you know how to suspect somebody of communism, you might be looking at your classmates a little bit differently when we meet on Thursday for Zoom. But here's a publicity photo of WAC, and ironic because in the background is a painting of the photograph that we saw taken on Iwo Jima of raising the American flag. And some would argue that the members of WAC are defending the United States. Others would argue that they were helping strip people of their constitutional rights. Who's this guy? Klaus Fuchs, another great spy name. He was a British scientist, physicist, I believe, who actually worked on the Manhattan Project and helping the United States create the bombs. And he betrayed the U.S. by giving atomic secrets to the USSR. That's why, in part, it only took them 3 years to develop the bomb after we did. Okay. As they investigated Fuchs, they uncovered a spy ring. So the question was, how many spies are in the United States? How effective are they? And what do we do about them? Here are two of the most famous alleged spies in history, Ethel and Julius Rosenberg. Ethel wearing her sort of Easter bonnet there, looks like she could be your kindly aunt. But they were spies, and they were arrested as part of the investigation into Klaus Fuchs. Ethel's brother, a man by the name of David Greenglass, gave his sister and brother-in-law's name to investigators in return for a lighter sentence for himself and his wife. So in the summer of 1950, they were arrested. They were known communists, which they didn't deny. Remember the case of Sacco and Vanzetti, where they claimed they were being put to death for being anarchists, not for being murderers. Ethel and Julius were accused of masterminding the atomic spy ring. Here's a picture of them in jail. And a jury found them guilty of conspiracy to commit treason, one of the highest crimes a person can commit and punishable by death. Excuse me. The judge sentenced them to death to force a confession. As a matter of fact, the judge did not believe that Ethel was guilty. He wanted a confession. Ethel and Julius refused, and as a result, they were executed at Sing Sing Prison in Ossining, New York, near where I grew up, in June of 1953. Just like Sacco and Vanzetti, historians years later have come to the conclusion that Ethel was innocent. She merely acted as a typist and didn't even know what she was typing, but that Julius was definitely involved in trying to get atomic secrets to the Soviet Union. This picture of people protesting in front of the White House kind of made me think of some of the protests we've seen in the last few days, where people want governors in certain states to lighten up the quarantine reasons. It says, do not permit fear to overcome justice. Many people today are saying the fear of COVID is causing more problems than the actual disease itself. I don't know if I'd agree with that, especially if I were a healthcare worker. So here's a photo of Joseph McCarthy, the senator from Wisconsin, who had been in the Senate for a number of years and hadn't even proposed any bills that got passed. He was kind of uninspiring, but he shrewdly realized that he could make a name for himself by leading on this anti-communist sentiment that was in the United States. And in Wheeling, West Virginia in 1950, he gave a speech. Unfortunately, there is no video or audio of that speech, but apparently he stood up in front of the group with a piece of paper in his hand, waving it and saying, "I have here in my hand a name of 27 suspected communists working in the State Department." And the next time he gave a similar speech, the numbers changed. And soon they were 200 or 300 accused communists, particularly in the State Department, people with access to secrets of the US government that they were allegedly giving to communist Soviet Union and other communist countries. He never proved his accusations. He never gave a name. He said communists were everywhere. Now, what would happen if I told him to stop it? What would happen if I told him he was going too far? He would turn around and say, "Kathleen, why do you care? Are you a communist?" He called for Truman's impeachment. He started attacking General Marshall, one of the most respected military men in the United States and the creator of the Marshall Plan. He used fear of communism to win public support. Finally, one person stood up against him. He was known to bully the opposition. He would make sweeping accusations without producing clear evidence. Today, the term McCarthyism, this is the definition of it. The other day, I was watching two reporters talk about the latest COVID conference on TV when the president spoke, and afterwards they said that he said at least 8 things that were falsehoods and that he couldn't prove. And one of the reporters said to the other one, "It's McCarthy-esque." And I made a mental note to tell you guys that, because this word is omnipresent now in English language. Senator Margaret Chase Smith from Maine finally stood up in the Senate and encouraged her fellow senators to speak out against him. Take a look at that little clip and see her bravery, because she, of course, could have been bullied. She could have lost her status as senator. She could have had voters turn against her, but she felt it was time. It's a very, very impressive speech. Finally, in 1953 and 1954, McCarthy accused the U.S. military, in particular the Army, of harboring communists. So televised hearings were held to further this inquiry, and this ultimately led to McCarthy's downfall. Televised hearings. By 1954, most Americans had a television set, small, black and white, in their home, and they could see for themselves how McCarthy made accusations without any evidence, how he shut people down and bullied any opposition. And his star began to fall. It culminated in a speech linked here, which I'd like you to see. Well, it's linked under classwork, where the guy said, "Have you no sense of decency, sir? At long last, do you have no sense of decency?" He had finally gone too far. And in December 1954, the Senate passed a resolution condemning McCarthy for his conduct. He died a few years later of alcoholism, a broken man, leaving a stain on American history.